Okay, everyone. Today we're looking to solve this particular equation. And this is a quadratic equation because I know if I go x times x, I get an x squared. And I also recognize that I have a number, x minus 3 is one number, times a second number, x plus 5, equal to 0. So the null factor law is going to apply here. But before I deal with that, let's do it graphically. And so if I'm going to do it graphically, I could use my calculator, but I'm also going to switch over to Desmos. And what I can see is if I graph y equals x minus 3, x plus 5, which is this equation here, if it equals 0, if y is 0, that means I'm looking for the x-intercepts. And so I can look at my graph here and see quite clearly that my x-intercepts are -5 and 3. And so if I do a quick sketch of this into my if I'm going to do it graphically, well, that means I'm going to have my graph, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this scenario here, like this, where this is -5, and this is 3, and so x equals -5 and x equals 3. There's my solutions graphically. I can also consider this by a table, by the data, by the numbers. I want the product to be 0. All right, so again, I can go to Desmos, or I can do this by hand. I'm going to take this, I'm going to convert it to a table. And as I continue the pattern, I get 0. I'm looking for zeros. And I can clearly see that here is 0. But I don't have, what happens if I go -3 or -4 or -5? Oh, there's my 0. And again, I can see from this table that I find from here, if I plug my table in, if I plug my table in, I can see quite clearly that I want this calculation to be 0 because that's what it's saying. That happens when x is 3, so x equals 3, or x equals -5. Now, when doing the table, if the answers being x are nice numbers, the table can work quite nicely for us. And we have all our, if x is -2, it produces the point -15 and so on. But if imagine the answer was x equal to 3.12, I would have a really hard time finding it with a table, but it can be helpful at times. And then finally, the algebra way to do this one is if I look at my equation, I recognize that x minus 3 times x plus 5 equals 0. There's multiplication implied there. So this number here times this other number here is 0. The only way two numbers multiply to get 0 is if the first number is 0 or the second number is 0. One of them has to be 0. And if I add 3, I get x to be 3. So there's one solution. Subtract the 5, and I get the other solution. And so there are two possible answers for this particular question. And that's a commonality. If you see an x squared, you should expect there's probably going to be 2. Now, that's not 100% true, but that's a good guiding rule for you. So using the null factor law, the table, or the graph. Let's try another example here. All right, so now we want to find the values of x that satisfy this particular equation. Okay, and so we can do it on the graph, or I am going to do it with my calculator from the graph as well. I could graph Desmos, which is much easier, but on your test, you're not going to have Desmos. So I enter into my graph the equation, and then I'm going to zoom to my standard window, and I see this. Okay, and so looking at my graph, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the graph here. I'm going to use the graph to estimate my values. So I think I'm going to estimate with red. I think this is -2, and I think this one's 4. All right, and so in my graph area here, I'm going to make a sketch, and I'm going to put in my graph this. All right, and so I'm going to start with this -2 one, and I'm going to use my calculator to do so. We did this to help factor earlier. So in order to do it, I'm going to go second, trace, which is the calculate menu, and number 2 is the 0. I'm going to hit number 2 to do the 0. Now the calculator is asking me a question. It's asking me for the left bound. And if I'm looking for this value here, which I think is -2, that's my guess, I want to be to the left of -2. So I could type -3. Now it's asking me another question. I want to be to the right of -2. So I'm going to be over the right-hand side. I could choose 0 or 1 or 2 or 3. Do not choose 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. That's too far right. I only want to have this one value in between the left and right bound. So I'm going to choose 0. Or -1 would work as well. And then my guess, well, I already guessed it'd be -2. And indeed it is -2. So I can see that this is -2. So x equals -2. Do the same procedure for this side here. I go second, calculate, and I'm going to do number 2 is a 0. My left bound, I'm going to go to the left of what I think is 4, so I'm going to type in 0, enter. The right bound, I'm going to pick 6 or 5 or 7, and I think it's going to be 4, and indeed it is 4. So this value here is 4, and so x equals 4. And so I have 2 solutions to this equation because I've said y is 0. Whenever y equals 0, you get the x-intercepts, and so that's what I've found. So x is -2 or 4. We could also do this with a table. If we go to our calculator, if I go second graph, which is my table, I can see all the numbers here, and I'm looking for this calculation to be 0. So if x is 0, I get -8. X is 1, I get -9. If I look here, I can see that this value here produces a 0. And so one answer is going to be x is equal to 4. Now if I go to my calculator, I want to see what's on the other direction. I can just toggle, and I can see that -2 also produces a 0. And so I can also see that -2 produces a 0 from the table, and so I know that x is equal to -2. And so I could go, just to throw some values, as -9, if 2 is -8, 4 is 0, and -2 is 0. And finally, algebraically, well, I better get these 2 answers algebraically. When I have this, one of the first things I notice is there's no common factor. This a value here in front of the x squared is 1. So if this value is 1, I can ask the magic question. And the magic question is what 2 numbers multiply to get -8 and add to get -2. Well, 2 numbers multiply to get -8. I know 4 and 2 multiply to get 8. If this one is negative and this one is positive, they will add to get -2. And so it's x minus 4, x plus 2 equal to 0. By the null factor rule, I can say that x minus 4 is 0. So x is 4. Or I could say x plus 2 is 0, so x is equal to -2. And again, there's 3 different ways to do it, and I'm doing same idea 3 different ways.